Welcome to today's Sawaal-Jawaab. Today we have Professor Shannon Olson with us. She's a principal investigator at NCBS, and her lab is studying how insects identify objects, say for example a predator, in their immediate environment. In today's talk, Professor Olson will provide an overview of how insects are important for the ecosystem. She'll also discuss how the rising pollution levels are affecting pollinators such as the Asian honeybee and the dronefly. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to make a small announcement. The Sawaal-Jawab sessions promote conversations in science, and if anyone has a question, please feel free to type them in the YouTube live chat. You can also post your questions through messages on Twitter and Facebook on our institute accounts. We will be following the questions posted and request Professor Olson to clarify the doubts as they come up. So please feel free to post your questions that you may have. With that, I request Shannon to please begin today's Sawaal-Jawab discussion.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to have you here with me, and I hope you really enjoy this talk. I'm really, really grateful for the invitation from Anishila and everyone to give this talk, and I hope you'll ask lots of questions. This is why I'm doing it. One of my greatest joys is to spread my love of nature and of insects with others and get people to be more excited about them. So I really hope you do ask questions. This quote, if you could see it on the screen, it says, "The creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for beetles." You might have heard this quote. It's by a very, very famous scientist named J.B.S. Haldane, who lived in India. He was British. He was a very famous geneticist, a very famous evolutionary biologist. Many of the concepts that we have in modern biology come from his brain, really, and his study of biological systems. And he lived in India for the last part of his life and worked at the Indian Statistical Institute. And we're not really sure if he said this or not. This is a perhaps apocryphal quote because, but there's this story that these philosophers asked him, what he felt about the creator, given biology, and he said that the creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for beetles, and that's really the point of my talk today. So I wanted to use that as my starting quote. This is a map of, not of India, obviously where I live and work, but actually of the United States, which is where I'm from. If you can see there's a tiny little purple triangle up in the top right of the screen. That is St. Lawrence County in New York State. That's the place where I was born. I'm from a very small town. I actually grew up surrounded by nature. So this is me. When I was 7 years old, I've always loved science. I'm the first generation college student, but my parents really taught me to be curious about the world around me and really encouraged me all my life. And, even to do things like this, my first science fair. And this is the area where I grew up. I grew up in a very, very
Hi, Shannon. Sorry to
Yeah?
interrupt you.
No problem.
There's a small issue with the audio. If you could just give us just 10 seconds to check it.
Sure.
Yeah, just 10 seconds. We'll be back.
No problem.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's taken care of. Yeah, you can now resume. Sorry. Yeah.
You can hear me though.
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay, very
okay.
good.
There was a small glitch,
great.
but we got it fixed. Yeah.
No problem. Just feel free to interrupt me if there's any problems. I know you're doing the best we can under these circumstances, and people are tired but very forgiving still for us. So so this is my backyard. So you see how I grew up. I grew up surrounded by nature. I grew up climbing trees, and I grew up surrounded by insects as well. So I started to become really interested in the world around me as a young child, and particularly about how all of these creatures that I saw, I saw crickets and frogs and ladybugs and squirrels and deer and raccoons and things like that around me in New York State. And how do they live? How do they go about doing their business every day? And particularly insects they're so common, they're so prevalent. I became fascinated by them. And that's why I ended up working in India. If any of you have ever heard me speak before, you've probably seen this image. I almost always show it in my talks because it really is at the heart of why I'm in India and what I do in India. India has an enormous biodiversity. My very first trip to India, I went to a Gumbe rainforest station, and I went with a student from NCBS, which is part of the reason why I ended up there. And he went light trapping. So he hung this light up hung the sheet up at night and shone a light on it, which attracts a lot of insects in the rainforest. And it was hundreds of species. You see here in this image, almost no two insects actually are the same in this image. They all are probably similar to moths and things like that, but they're completely different creatures. And I was amazed. I've never seen so much diversity in my life. So I really had to come to India and learn more about this beautiful biodiversity that India has, and learn from the people and learn from the scientists. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I've been here for the last 7 years. So Haldane's quote about fondness for beetles was not wrong, actually. You might have seen an image like this before. This is the so-called tree of life. This follows the evolution of life from starting from the earliest forms of life, which were bacteria, going through all the forms of life from left to right to the very, very tip, which is some of the more modern species, including humans. And if you look in the middle there, there's this massive red blotch, which really is the biggest of all the segments. And those are all the invertebrates. And most of those are actually insects. There are so many insects on this planet. In fact, there are nearly as many insects on this planet as there are all other forms of multicellular life and known microbes, excluding bacteria. Bacteria win. There's more bacteria than anything else, but otherwise, insects really are the winners in terms of animals here. So there's so many of them. And you might wonder, who cares about insects, right? Because this is the view most of us have now, right? I mean, those of you listening from Hyderabad, or those of you listening from Bangalore, where I live, this is a drone shot of Bangalore. This is where we are now. There is some green spaces. We do see trees, we do see flowers, but we're mostly growing up in our cities now and converted to our cities. So we are surrounded by these things, right? Like cockroaches and mosquitoes and flies. And these are not the insects that any of us really are excited about, right? No one wants cockroaches in their kitchen. No one wants flies on their dinner plate. And certainly no one wants mosquitoes biting them, because they could carry lots of diseases, right? So we've come in our modern life to really fear and be afraid of insects. And oftentimes when I work with children, if I work with children from rural areas of India, they're of course quite fine and they're used to insects. But of course, if you've grown up in a city, these are the kind of insects you see. And so you're grown up to be kind of afraid of them. So, and this is a bad thing, because actually insects are super important for our survival. And so I would just want to give a few examples of how important insects are, and why we need them on our planet, and how important they are to the future of our planet. So when we talk about something called ecosystem services, okay, ecosystem services is a term that's commonly used by biologists, sustainability scientists, and lots of people to talk about the benefits that our ecosystems provide to us as humans and to other organisms on the planet. And we usually separate those, at least one of the ways of doing it, is into 4 categories of supporters, regulators, provisioners, and cultural services. So I'm just going to give a few examples for each of those, and I will start with the supporters. Okay, so here we have a dung beetle, which is also really common to India. Cicadas, also really common to India. And I'm sure you've all seen termite mounds as well. And you probably don't think much about these things, but actually a dung beetle, which as the name implies, it eats and it rolls up these dungs into these dung balls. You might have seen these as a child as well. They actually save farmers about $450 million per year worldwide because of the degradation of the fecal products from cattle and cow dung, which are extremely important. They break it down, they get into the soil, so it acts as a fertilizer. So there's enormous benefit just from this one single insect. And cicadas, as you might know, they often come out in groups. They come out in large emergences, especially in the United States where I'm from. You hear these famous stories about these cicadas that come out in the millions, but actually it happens all over the world. And these cicadas, when they do this group emergence, they have release an enormous amount of nitrogen, which is a fundamental chemical that life needs. And they release this into the soil, and that gives benefits to the microbes and plants that then grow based upon the soil nutrients. And termites And other creatures like ants that actually terraform, they actually make soil. So they're incredibly important for the very basis of what helps us to survive, the soil and the air and the nutrients. Another thing that insects do are as regulators. This is also something we don't normally think about, right? You usually think about if you have an insect eating your plants, that's a bad thing. So probably if you have a terrace garden, or maybe if you live in a more rural area, maybe you have a garden outside, you probably are always shooing away insects because of course we don't want them eating up our lettuce and our tomatoes and all of those things we're growing. But in fact, insects are really important. Plants, we think about, especially in our city-starved areas where we don't have much greenery, we want more and more greenery. But imagine if plants grew unchecked on this planet and there was nothing stopping them from growing. It would be equally bad. They would choke out all the sun and the light and the benefits of soil. It would be hard for other organisms like animals to survive. So actually, they regulate plant growth. It is actually a beneficial thing. Sometimes, of course, that's bad, like when we're trying to grow food, but it also is a big benefit to our green covered areas of the world. This insect on the right, you probably think this is an ant, but if you count it, it has actually 8 legs. It's not an insect, it's actually a spider. It's a very famous spider called an ant mimicking spider, and they're super common. They're common all over the campus where I work at NCBS in northern Bangalore. And arthropods, like spiders are not insects, as you know, but they're closely related, arachnids. They and other predators regulate many animal species and many other insects, and they keep everything in check. And that balance is extremely important to our environment. So we often think of these things as bad, eating plants, killing other organisms. But in fact, that's a very important thing to make sure that everything is regulated and everything is balanced. When we go for a provisioning services, this is one which I think will be most easy for everyone here to relate to, because these are things that you probably already know about, right? So I'm going to give you a few interesting examples from science. So these 3 examples are how insects have inspired us as scientists to come up with new ways of doing things. On the lower right, you see this beautiful video of this ladybug taking flight. And in fact, insect flight has inspired how we build drones, how we build aircraft, how we build lots and lots of aerial propulsion items. And you probably know on the top right, this is called a fruit fly. Fruit flies have been so important to us as scientists to help us to understand the molecular and genetic basis of life. And they continue to be a very, very important species of study. And this darkling beetle on the left, which actually lives in the Namib deserts in Africa, it actually does something super amazing. It has a very special coating on its exoskeleton, on its beetle carapace, and actually it can collect fog, it can collect rainwater, and that's how it actually gets its water to its body. And this technology that it has developed biologically over evolutionary time has been harnessed by scientists as a way to actually collect water in very harsh environments and be able to keep it by collecting it from the air. So insects also serve as a great inspiration to us for our own technologies and knowledge. And of course, they also serve direct benefits as well. We know of pollinators like honeybees that give us honey and pollinate our crops so that they can survive. You also know about the bottom right, silk moths. Silk, of course, such an important product for us in India, and it's also important across the world. And insects provide lots of benefits like that. And also even ants, we often don't think of ants as giving us benefit, but besides the soil creation that I mentioned before, they also have been inspirational to economists because they're unbelievable ways of organizing their labor together. So these social colonies that they have provide an inspiration to understand how supply and demand and cooperation work in societies. So they've also inspired that as well. And finally, insects also serve important cultural services, also to us in India, but all over the world. On the left, you'll see a type of Artemisia. Artemisia is a famous group of plants that provide medicinal qualities all over the world, including in India. And on the right, you'll see the lock insect. And the lock insect is actually very famous. It's very famous to Jain, but also very famous in ancient texts in India as well, to make the shellac. You know, you've probably seen shellac bangles that are used, and it's very important to us in India. And that's also an insect that has been created. So insects actually provide important services to us in all different ways. And that's why we study them. So our lab is called the NICE lab. It means Naturalist Inspired Chemical Ecology. And we take our inspiration from nature, and we don't just work on insects. We actually do work on a lot of different organisms, but insects are our favorite species. But you'll see here, we also work on tigers. We work on tiger chemical communication, how tigers use odors and chemicals to communicate with each other. We work in agriculture and integrated pest management, ecological management of insects without using pesticides, like here in the coffee plantations in Coorg. We work on in the Himalayas on pollination, and we even work with these big four-legged insects. They're not insects, of course, they're antelope, they're black buck. You're probably familiar with them, and how they also use information from their environment to identify each other. And you see the male and the female there. So we do work with a lot of different organisms, but insects are our favorite. And it was honestly from all of these experiments that we've been doing all over the country and all of these beautiful ecosystems of India that we started to notice that our ecosystems are rapidly changing. We are changing our world so fast. We are changing it in terms of the not only how we live on the planet, building cities, building towns, building roads, but also we're changing the climate, we're changing the land, we're changing the air and the water in every possible way. And that is known as the Anthropocene. You've probably heard of Jurassic Park and Triassic periods and things like that. These are geological periods in Earth history. Pleistocene, there's many names to them. So this geological era is a new one that has been named after the single most influential species that has ever occurred on the planet, us. Anthro means human, and the Anthropocene is the new geological era entirely denoted by the effect of humans on the planet, because we affect it in every possible way, including geologically. And I love this image. It's not mine. It's by Pranshu Dubai. And he took it. You've probably seen this if you've ever been to Mumbai, right? But this is a really poignant image because it's really, really shows the difficulties in thinking about things in the Anthropocene with, the cities on one side, rich and poor, and nature right in the middle. And how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to survive as human beings, help us, help our growth and development going forward, help us to live sustainably while also trying to preserve our environment? That is a big task. And that's really what this time in history is all about. And that's what I feel as a scientist that I need to at least try to contribute to as much as I can. We are faced with something called the Great Extinction, is what I call it. And this is something that really prompted me around 2017 to really change my research. There was a paper that came out then, and this is one of the figures from that paper. It came out in PLOS ONE. And it was a study that had been done over the last 40 years, okay? They'd been studying insects in different places across 40 years, just collecting them and seeing how many are there. And they observed an 80% loss in biomass. So to put that into context, we have about roughly 8 billion people on our planet. So imagine you have 8 billion people on our planet today, and 40 years from now, we only have 2 billion because, the other 80% are gone. I mean, that would be so shocking. We would be having just mass pandemonium, right? We would be so scared because what has happened to all the people, but yet that has happened to these insects on our planet, 80% of them, and serving all of those functions that I mentioned to you before, all of those really essential ecosystem services that keep our world in balance and help us to live. They provide us the soil for the plants that we eat and the animals that we eat, and they provide us clean water and air. So this is a really, really scary thing. And it's caused by lots of factors, right? One is an obvious one, right? Things like our cities, and the way we are also forming our cities and taking up space, producing things like light pollution, as you see here, that also has a severe effect on our insect life, as you've seen insects swarming around your streetlights at night. Also, the use of pesticides obviously has a very big impact on insects. I hate that term pesticides, right? Because it's really a misnomer. Pesticide sounds nice, right? You want to get rid of pests, but actually they are insecticides because they don't kill just the pests. They kill anything that comes across them, which means they kill all sorts of beneficial insects and beneficial species. And almost all the insects on our planet are beneficial. Only a very small number of them actually cause trouble for us as humans. And that's mainly because we are making them out of balance with their ecosystems. Another thing is how we're changing our land, how we're breaking up the land and splitting it up into tiny and tinier pieces and not providing corridors and swaths of land so that our insects and other animals can move from place to place. We're breaking them up into tiny little patches across the planet. So one of the things that we did was we study pollination. I mentioned pollination a couple of times. I know you know about pollination. Pollination is very, very important for most of our flowering species. 90% of our plants actually use animal pollination to some extent for their survival. That includes not only our crops, but all flowering species on the planet. About 30% of our crops require animal pollination for their fertility. And the pollination is necessary because otherwise you don't have fruit. So all our tomatoes and our mangoes and our nuts as well would also go away. Almonds, of course, would go away without animal pollination. And much of that is performed by insects like bees and flies. Sort of the outskirts, but we also actually do a lot of work in places like Lalbagh, the botanical garden in Bangalore, and various areas of the city. It is called a garden city. And yes, it's definitely much less of a garden than it used to be since it's such a big city now, but there are still a lot of green spaces. There's a lot of trees and flowers. And so we try to do local research on our insects if we can. But we noticed just anecdotally, this is kind of we call it back of the envelope calculation. We just did this just quick studies, quick survey. It's not a very thorough one of how many insects there are in the center of the city versus on the outskirts as you go outside of the city, like to places like north of us, going towards something called Nandi Hills, if you've ever been to Bangalore and been to Nandi Hills. And we noticed that there were fewer pollinators in the urban areas than the outskirts. Just when we were wondering why that is. And so we thought maybe it has to do with the fact that there's less for them to eat, maybe less flowers, maybe less water, maybe it's hotter or drier, or maybe they're using pesticides too, because they do a lot of fogging for mosquitoes, of course. So we started doing some research on this. So Geeta, who is this brilliant young scientist in my lab, she's a postdoctoral researcher. This has really been all of her work. So I really want to highlight her here. So she took this on. So when she joined the lab, she said, I really want to work on this. So she selected 4 areas of the city. And she tried to select areas of the city that were similar in as many ways as possible, meaning they had similar amounts of greenery, they had similar plant species, including this one, which is called a Tacoma stans, this trumpet flower, which grows into this pretty large bushy tree. You've probably seen it. It's really common all over India. And also she found the presence of these honeybee colonies. And this particular honeybee that you just saw flying around is called the giant Asian honeybee. It is one of 6 different native honeybee species that we have in India. And it also is really important. It provides about 80% of the honey, and it pollinates almost 600 different species of flowers just in Karnataka alone, where we live and work. And so she wanted to study this insect to see if what she could find was the difference between them. So she selected these areas because they were all, similar proximity to buildings, similar proximity to traffic, similar proximity to water, as much as possible, try to regulate the different ecosystems that she was part of. And the one thing that differed in them that we suspected may have an influence was air pollution, because India has some of the most polluted cities in the world. I'm sure you realize this. This map here that you see of India is actually the level of air pollution in different regions. You see there's very high pollution in northern India, but there's also quite high pollution throughout the country. The red areas are higher pollution, higher air pollution. And even Bangalore has rising air pollution as well. And so these sites were also selected because they had different levels of air pollution. The low site was actually on our campus. It had a pretty low air pollution. The moderate site was actually Lal Bagh Botanical Gardens, but that's right in the heart of the city. So it's actually surrounded all by the city. So it does have a relatively high level of air pollution. The high site is an area called Pina, which is an industrial center that's very close to NCBS. Actually, it's only a few kilometers away. And the rural site is actually on our sister campus, ICTS, which is also a TFR campus, which is actually quite a far outside the city. And that's in a rural area called Hesargata. So all the sites she chose were quite similar, except for this level of air pollution. And we started to look at these honeybees. And so the first thing we observed is, yes, not only back of the envelope, but truly the number of bees did seem to decrease. The number of bees that we saw visiting flowers at the site did decrease with increasing air pollution. So you can see the trend. The highest number of bees was in the rural area, low, medium, high. It goes right in a nice linear way. And interestingly, the time that they spent visiting the flowers also changed. We're not sure why that is. It could be because of the maybe the broad number of flowers, number of foliage that they could get to was less, which means they had to spend more time feeding per flower. It wasn't true for the particular site, but maybe broadly outside of our sites, they had less flowers, but the nectar content seemed to be the same. It also might be that the flowers were not in good shape. We didn't actually get a chance to look at how the air pollution was affecting them. Then came the next step. So the first thing that Gita did after doing these observations, seeing if there's something to our study that maybe we want to study it, was she captured them. And Gita happens to be a brilliant artist when it comes to this. This is called a scanning electron micrograph. Scanning electron microscopy is a really great way that scientists can use to take very, very high magnification images of a surface. So this is actually a bee's leg. It's the bee's knees, actually. And on this leg of this bee, you can see some hairs that it has, which are probably sensory hairs. And also you can see these little sort of coffee bean shaped things, which are pollen grains, right? So this is a bee that she collected from our campus. And this was the very first image she ever took of these bees. This is an Asian honeybee leg. And you can see that she was doing her job. And then she took a bee from the highly polluted site of Pina. And this is really the first image we saw. And I've shown this before in other talks because this is the first time I'd ever seen an image from my lab that made me cry. I hope you can see the difference between this last image here and this image, right? You can see there's a lot of stuff on this bee's body. This is the same region of the bee. This is also the bee leg, but you can hardly see pollen grains, a few here and there. But mostly what you see is, I don't know, something. It looks like crud. And we decided to look at this and see, what is this? Are they just dirty? Maybe this bee was just really dusty, right? Maybe it was covered in dirt. And of course, yes, there is some dirt there. But when we did an analysis of this using something called EDAX, which is a way of doing elemental analysis and finding what are the elements that this debris is composed of. And we found lead, arsenic, tungsten, aluminum, chromium, cobalt, all of these heavy metals. And even if you're not a scientist, I'm sure you probably know that things like lead and arsenic are extremely toxic. They're not only toxic to humans, but they're also toxic to almost all life, including insects as well. And also tungsten and aluminum, these were not bad, but these are very, very common chemicals found in air pollution. So what you see on this bee's body is actually something called respirable suspended particulate matter. When we think about air pollution, we think about air pollution not only in terms of gaseous forms like carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide, but also in terms of these particles that we breathe in that are produced by smoke, exhaust from cars, industrial effluents, burning garbage, burning biomass. All of these things are tiny particles that we breathe in. They clog up our lungs as humans. They even get into our bloodstream. They can cause arterial blockage. And this is what we're seeing on the bee's body, is this respirable suspended particulate matter. So this is why when we started to think, oh my God, what is going on here? Because this is Bangalore, right? Bangalore is not the most polluted city in the country by far. It's actually not even in the top 100 polluted cities in the world. Whereas, Delhi is often in our top 10, as is Patna, Varanasi, and several of our other Lucknow as well. So then we started to look at this a little bit further, and I can hope you can see on the screen, we have a heartbeat of a bee on the left from a low polluted area. This is from our campus again. This is what a heart of an insect looks like. This is a bee's heart. They do have a beating heart, just like a human heart beats. They don't have the same circulatory system. They don't have veins and arteries the way we do. They have something called an open circulatory system. So if you're open up an insect, do open heart surgery the way Gita did, you actually, all of their hemolymph, which is their blood, actually is flowing throughout their body, but they still pump it to get the fluid, get all of the nutrients, get the oxygen flowing to all of their extremities. So the heart is very important for them, just like it is for us. And you can see this nice heartbeat beating back and forth from this insect. Now on the right, now you'll see beating the heartbeat from a bee from a highly polluted area. And I hope you can see the difference. It's not that it's actually beating more slowly, it's actually beating slow and fast at the same time. It's beating, fast on one side, it's beating slow on the other. We actually saw bees having heart attacks. Their bees would stop for several seconds, sometimes even several minutes before they started beating again when they were from a highly polluted area. This is something that we would call cardiac arrhythmia, an unrhythmic heartbeat. This is extremely dangerous for humans. If you go into the doctor and the doctor says you have cardiac arrhythmia, you're in big trouble. You need to get medical care right away. And so this obviously is not something that's really great for these bees. So we saw this is just the interval between the heartbeats, and it just shows you that the bees from the highly polluted area on the right have a much higher deviation in their rhythmicity. They're not very regular in their heart rate, so they have arrhythmia. We also looked at their blood cells. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a blood cell from a bee on the left from our low polluted area, and a blood cell on the right. The reason it looks so strange on the right is actually because it's dead. And in fact, most of the blood cells that we collected from the blood of bees from the highly polluted area were dead, which means they don't have very good immunity for things. Just like for humans, our blood cells serve a number of purposes, also help us with immunity, and they serve in really essential immune functions for insects. Insects don't have immunity the way we do as humans. They don't really have a secondary immunity. They can't really get vaccines the way we can, like we have done for COVID-19. They actually have a different type of immune system, but they do have immunity, of course. They can fight off infections and disease, and their blood cells play a key role in this. So having a lot of dead blood cells is really, really not good for them. And we even found that they actually have changes in their genetic expression. So we all know that fundamentally all organisms are made up of DNA, and the DNA gets translated to something called RNA, which is where some of the vaccines came from, and then it becomes proteins, which are the building blocks of life. So we looked at how those genes, the RNA is actually being expressed in various ways, and we saw very big changes for several genes that I will just explain to you what they are. These are genes for things like stress. These are genes for responding to toxins. They're genes for building up oils as protections for the external structures of the body. So all of these genes for stress and immunity were all being upregulated, which is a very good indication that these bees were being stressed when they were in the highly polluted areas. So then of course, the question is, what does this do to the bee, right? All of these things are happening. Their heartbeat, their blood cells are changing, their gene expression is changing. All of these things are changing. And in fact, we do see also a drastic reduction in survival. So how we measured this was we took the bees back, we collected them in small numbers, and we took them back with us from the field into our laboratory. We gave them lots of water and lots of food to eat so that they would be able to survive. And we just watched them, and we watched them over several days. And while our bees from the rural site where I mentioned ICTSs and from the low polluted site, they were about 60% to 80%. Sometimes they'd live for several days or weeks. From the moderate and highly polluted areas of the city, 80% of them were dead within 24 hours. So we saw a huge, drastic reduction in survival. Now, as scientists, of course, we have to be skeptical of our results. These results seem very shocking and very disturbing. And to me, they seemed quite convincing, but we still don't know, right? Because we weren't able to control the pollution. These are just wild bees flying around. Well, we didn't know. Maybe even though we controlled for these regions, the areas where we worked in didn't have pesticide use, we didn't know. Maybe they were getting exposed to pesticides somewhere else. These bees do fly for several hundred meters to kilometers in a day they can fly. So maybe they were being exposed to other toxins. So we wanted to test whether it really is air pollution that's having these effects or maybe something else. And for that, we couldn't use honeybees because this Asian honeybee, as you know, is quite a hard bee to domesticate. It's very hard to culture in a lab environment. So we took to another very famous insect, the fruit fly, okay? The fruit fly, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, is really important to scientists. And actually, NCBS has a national fruit fly facility. It provides fruit flies to scientists all over the country and even all over the world to do research. So we had ready access to them. So we took 1,000 fruit flies, okay, and we put them into cages, okay, and we put those cages up into a sheltered area in each of our places, from the rural area, the low and the mid and the highly polluted region. In the sites we put these cages there, and we left them there for 7 days. Okay, so these are maybe 2 to 4 day old flies, and we gave them food and water, and we changed it every couple of days to make sure they had fresh food and water. And we left them there for 7 days and to see what would happen to these fruit flies. So these fruit flies now, everything is the same. They have the same genetic background. They have the same food, same water. The only thing that's different is now they're exposed to these different environments. They can't even fly around in them. They're just stuck in the cage. And we made sure that they weren't in the sun. You could see they're sheltered a little bit. So they were out of the sun and the wind, so they wouldn't, get burnt to a crisp or get desiccated. And we saw the same thing. In fact, 80% of the fruit flies after our 7-day trials were dead. And this was like 21,000 flies we did this with over the experiment. We saw the same change in their gene expression. These, of course, they have different genes. They're fruit flies and not bees, but the same type of genes were changing for stress and toxicity. And even when we looked at their bodies, you can see this is a wing of a fruit fly. And on the left, we see the wing from a low polluted area. And on the right, we see the wing from a highly polluted area, and you see it's covered in this debris. So in fact, and we saw the same types of elements on their body as well. So we see that this is actually happening in the same way as it is for the honeybee, which gave us a confidence that air pollution is really causing some problems. And we don't often think about it, right? We usually think of air pollution as something that's only affecting humans. And in fact, that's how we even measure air pollution. We measure air pollution. Okay, air pollution is a thing you can measure in gas and respirable suspended particulate matter levels, things like this. But we convert it to something called an air quality index. And this is the thing you hear about when you hear about, oh, Delhi had an AQI of 400 today or something like that. That comes from, it's a dimensionless number that actually comes from how air pollution is affecting humans. So this is roughly the scale for India, okay? So anything below 50 is fine. It's really good air quality, okay? Anything for under 100 is okay. Maybe if you're really sensitive, you have very, very bad breathing problems, you might have a little bit of an effect. And above 100, you start to see effects. And above 150, it starts to get hard for most people to be out for long periods of time. You start to feel it. And if you've been to some of these highly polluted cities and certain times a year, you know what I'm talking about. You can taste it in the air, actually. So this is how we measure air quality. But using our data, if we now look at it, not an air quality index for humans, but an air quality index for bees, you can see that after 50, it's already pretty bad for our insects. And after 100, which is actually not so bad for humans, it's very poor, which means our insects are even more sensitive to air pollution than we are to humans. But all of our legislation, not only in India, but what is recommended by the World Health Organization, the UN, everybody, is all based upon humans. It's all based upon how air pollution affects us and not how it affects the animals around us. This is only pollinators. Our study was, as far as we know, one of the first in the world to look at actually how air pollution is really quantitatively affecting animals. So it's probably affecting birds and our plants and other animals as well. And so
Shannon,
we hope that our please.
Shannon, we have a question that has come for quite some time. So would you be open to taking this question? Because
Sheila?
Okay, so this question is there on YouTube. Like, what are the elements or substances in particular that cause cardiac arrhythmia in bees, and how does it do so?
That's a great question. So that's actually it's a very timely question too, because it's what I was just going to say, right? So the thing is we don't know right now because we weren't able to control the air pollution, right? So we would actually have to produce the air pollution in controlled ways, give them, air pollution that's composed of arsenic more or lead more, to really try to figure out which elements of the air pollution are really causing this. And at NCBS, we have no way of making air pollution in a controlled environment, but actually we do have a new collaboration with a lab. It happens to be all the way over in Canada, in Vancouver, and as soon as the pandemic allows us, we wanted to go a year ago, but we've had to wait. Gita will be going there, and she will actually be repeating these experiments with controlled levels of air pollution to try to get an exact question. My answer is I don't know, but we're trying to find out. So if I were to give this talk again in a year, I might have an answer. I will tell you something else, though. One of the things that Gita was able to do was she was able to get back to these sites in a limited fashion during the lockdown. Now, the lockdown was horrific for all of us, right? It was very, very bad for our economy. It was very bad for our migrant workers, and it had enormous impacts on everyone. But what it did do is it stopped all of the traffic, all of the industries. It gave us some time, right? A breather. And you experienced this. All of us experienced, if we were in the cities at the time, we experienced, just things seemed to change overnight almost. So she took this time to really try to measure the same parameters, the heartbeat, the air quality, of course, she measured, but that was also being measured by the Karnataka Pollution Board. She measured did SEMs on them, and she's also doing PCR. And we're just getting the results now. But the good thing is it looks like things did improve for the bees. So actually just stopping the air pollution for a short while, just a month or two, actually did seem to have an improvement on their life. I can't give you the exact numbers right now because we're still processing the data, but that is good news, which means it's not too late, right? Which means these effects are likely not permanent, and we can turn things around if we start doing a better job taking care of our planet. So that's some really great news, and we're hoping to publish that study very soon once we have the data analyzed. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Shannon. I think we can go ahead with
the
talk.
Yeah, so I'm actually almost done with the talk. I'm at the 40 minute mark, so I'm just about finished anyways. And I just wanted to say that insects, they are really essential to our planet. There's an estimation that if insects were to leave, that we would survive only about 3 months because of all the benefits that they have. And we often don't think much about them, right? We think about things like our beautiful tigers and our elephants and even our birds, but the insects themselves actually, which are very important to sustain those animals as well, we don't think about. So I hope that you, when you go out to your terrace garden, you see an insect, don't immediately shoo it away, right? It might be actually trying to pollinate your flowers. It might be trying to eat another insect that's trying to eat your garden. So really take a moment to look at it and observe, what is it actually doing? Is it actually hurting you, or is it actually maybe helping you? And maybe when you go for a walk, maybe with your children, or if your children are listening to this talk, that they can stop and take a moment to observe the insects around, and you start to see them. When you start to get the eyes for observing insects, you see them everywhere, and they're doing their jobs for us as humans all the time. And we have a lot of big problems coming up, not only this pandemic that we're coming out of, but an infectious disease and livelihoods and environmental damage, and a lot of these things that the World Economic Forum says as global risks actually involve preserving our ecosystems for insects as well. And infectious disease, which is partially carried by insects, is also can be addressed from an ecosystem standpoint. So all of these things are very important, which means, what can you do, right? This is the question, I think, that Anya, what can I do as an individual? How can I possibly have any impact on this? I can't change the air pollution. I'm not doing anything myself. You probably think about this all the time. You feel quite helpless as an individual, actually, often being able trying to make things better on our planet. But actually, there's a lot you can do. You know, I mentioned this, but having a garden, having green spaces, promoting green spaces are incredibly important, not only in our cities, but all over. Not just planting trees, but trees aren't always the best thing for insects. They are important, but also grasslands are important. Also, things we think of as wastelands, which are like wetlands, are extremely important for our insect life and all of our animal life, and promoting those and actually sponsoring those in your local areas is important. If you can have a garden for insects, if you can have a terrace garden. I have a very small terrace, okay, but I still have a lot of plants on them. And I see the bees and flies come to them and visit them. If you can have the means to, if you can try to buy organic food as much as possible, find out where the food is coming from, see how they're growing it, try to regulate that. Now, organic food's really expensive, so I know this is not everybody's means, but if you can, please do that. Please sponsor better ways of doing natural farming and reducing pesticide use. And also supporting things like, for example, these animal corridors, which we are finding coming up all over the world. Those are also very important, not only for big animals like elephants, but also for organisms like insects, and promoting those. Being aware of where we're building our roads and our infrastructure, and thinking about, is it really a wasteland that we're building this road over, or this building over? And thinking about ways of rather living with our ecosystems and in and amongst them, and not trying to fight against them all the time. These are all things we can do as individuals, as voters, as gardeners, as citizens of the city. So we all can play our part in this, and it's really important. I want to end with this quote that I'll read to you, because the text might be really small on your screen, especially if you're listening to me on a mobile, which it really affected me. It also came out in 2017, which is about this time where we really switched our lab over to really looking at these topics more. And I found it very, very powerful. And I hope you do as well. And it really sums up how important this is. But to think about the coming invertebrate extinctions is to confront a different dimension of loss. So much will vanish before we even knew it was there, before we had even begun to understand it. Species aren't just names or points on an evolutionary tree or abstract sequences of DNA. They encode countless millennia of complex interactions between plants and animals, soil and air. Each species carries with it behaviors we have only begun to witness, chemical tricks honed over 1 million generations, whole worlds of mimicry and violence, maternal care and carnal exuberance. To know that all of this will disappear is like watching a library burn without even being able to pick up a single book. Our role in this destruction is a kind of vandalism against their history and ours as well. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions. I welcome you. If you happen to be in Bangalore, you can please look me up. You can message me. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. Let me know. I'd be happy to have you come visit me in the lab. So thank you so much, and keep the insects.
Thank you, Shannon. We have a question here. So this is a little, referring to little initial portion of your talk where you say that one of your lab members decided to look at different regions in Bangalore and then looked at the
Yes,
number of flowers and I think it was I'm
yes,
just trying to put the context here because that has not been entirely put in the question here.
yes.
The question here is, how did you design such experiments? So the timing measurement of how much the pollinators are spending on the flowers, and so are these like time lapse photography?
Yeah.
How do you measure? What's the
No, no.
experiment look like?
We use these two things on my head. We used our eyes. Okay. So the very cool thing, I'm going to brag a little bit about my campus. NCBS is an incredibly cool place to be because we do a lot of different kinds of research. It's really a remarkable place. One of the other reasons I came to India, I do talk about the biodiversity, but it's also because NCBS is just a fantastic place to do science. And they have all these technologies and techniques available. We also have some fabulous ecologists. So we worked with, for example, Mahesh Sankaran's lab. He's a community ecologist. So we worked with his lab members to help us find the best places in the city that were matching as many characteristics as possible, so we could control as much as possible. Like I mentioned, things like traffic, things like water bodies, things like tree cover, things like that. So they actually specialize in this. So we worked with them. We worked with Axel Brockman, who specializes in honeybee behavior, to help us design those experiments. So we watched the bees. We literally went out and watched them for a very specific time period, and we did it at many different times of year. So we tried to control for effects of monsoon or summer or winter temperatures and conditions. So we tried to go out as much as possible, and also always measure the air pollution whenever we went. We had a portable RSPM meter that we could measure the air pollution at each point in time and control for that. So we used our eyes. We also worked with Dandapani Purundarai, who is a cardiac scientist. He helped us with the heart data. We worked with Radhika Venkatesan, who's also a chemical ecologist. Her lab was doing these hemolymph and these blood cell experiments. And our lab also has a fantastic genomics facility, and that helped us with understanding the gene expression. So we got lots of help doing this. We did not do this on our own, but that's one of the fantastic things of being on a campus like NCBS, is we get to work with so many people. So.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question that has come up. What if a species is gone? There are several species which have gone extinct. Does the entire ecosystem then come up with a new species and a mechanism? Is there another species that replaces the bees?
Such an important question. Not an easy question to answer, but I will do my best. Okay. So species birth and death. Species do come into being. That's called speciation. New species, actually, we have created several species that have specialized on some of our crops over the last couple 100,000 years that we've been actually on the planet doing I shouldn't say couple 100,000, 20,000 years or so since we've had agriculture. We've actually created new species who have specialized on our crops. So birth and death of species it is part of evolution, okay? So species going extinct in itself is not necessarily a problem. The problem is the rate at which extinction is happening. And we have had great extinction events happening over the history of our planet that are evidenced in the fossil record. You can see this happening, and we've survived, right? Things have come back. This species extinction that we're seeing across our planet is happening largely because of us and how we are changing our planet. And it's happening really rapidly, okay? And that's where the problem lies. The problem lies is it's not just one species, right? You're right, one species is gone. In fact, we know that insects are becoming extinct at very alarming rates. And many times we don't even know what they are. There are so many insects on this planet. There's so many species that we haven't even identified. And so probably an insect was there and has gone extinct and we don't even know it was there, right? So exactly. So a single species itself probably is not going to throw the ecosystem out of balance entirely unless it serves in a very important function. Because it's a very high number, or it's a very specific ecosystem where it plays a key role. But that's not the problem. The problem is that so many things are changing that the planet doesn't have time to adjust to it, right? So birth and death is part of evolution, and the planet adjusts, and we adjust to this all the time, but it's happening so quickly that we can't adjust to it. And that's what the scary thing is. And things like air pollution, pesticide use, land use change, light pollution, all of the things that we're doing to our planet play a role in that. So that's what you have to keep in mind. It's not just one beetle here or one moth there. It's that it's so many of them. 80% of insect biomass in the last 40 years, 80%. That's what's scary. And that's what is really dangerous. Can we come back from it? Yeah, of course. Of course we can. You saw, I mean, I mentioned that when we went into lockdown, we saw that the bees, that they were starting to, things were starting to recover for them as well. We absolutely can do it. It's not the end. But this is the time we have to do it. We are actually running out of time. We're starting to see already drastic changes happening on our planet, more wildfires, more flooding, more drought, things like this. And so we can change things. And it's little things like this, even just little things like having a garden, caring, recycling things, using less plastic, buying organic if you have the means to do so. All of these things are really important choices that we can make as individuals.
There's another question. Do you see a difference in the ways the bees which have crud on them, a difference in behavior between bees which have not been exposed to air pollution versus the ones where you found the metal crud?
Yeah, so we didn't observe the general behaviors for a long period of time. So a lot of people have asked us about the hives, okay? And this is a question that I'm gonna, because that would help us to see the behavior. For example, if we could go into the hives that we have. So one thing was that the hives are, because these were wild species, these are giant Asian honeybee. They're called the rock bee. If you've very likely seen them, especially if you're in a city in India, they grow their nests like usually under the eaves of buildings, like in concrete buildings. You'll see, and it looks like a rock, right? The hive looks like a solid rock. And they're quite aggressive. So a lot of people try to get rid of the hives. They burn them. Do not burn these hives. Okay, you're burning your food and your pollination and your honey if you burn the hives. There are specialized people. There's people in Bangalore that can move the hives for you, so they can be moved, okay, safely. But yeah, they are quite aggressive. So observing them is a bit tricky. So we really only observed their pollination behavior. That was the thing that we were most interested in at the time. We did observe differences in how long they spent on a particular flower. I mentioned that. We didn't observe differences in their flight and things like that. Nothing really stark. But again, we weren't really looking at their behavior quite closely. So I guess my science answer is I'm not sure what effect it had on their behavior, but it certainly had a lot of effect on their physiology and their ability to survive.
So as of now, we don't have any other questions on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. So I think it's almost 5. So I think we've almost come to the end of today's session. And thank you so much, Shannon, for this wonderful talk. It's actually got everyone thinking. And there's the experiments that you've done actually give us a way to see how the air pollution is affecting the pollinators so severely. And we thank you so much for your time for conducting this discussion today and patiently answering all our questions. And we hope we can have more talks on related topics sometime in the near future. So we'll also like to thank everyone for joining in this session and also interacting with the speaker. And we'll keep you updated of any of the sessions which we have planned for the upcoming months. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Thank you so much. Everyone, I hope you can go for a walk, see some insects, observe them.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.